U.S. court appearance, both pleading not guilty to federal drug and weapons charges. Maduro addressing himself to the judge as the president of Venezuela, also, quote, a prisoner of war.
In the 48 hours since his capture, President Trump has insisted that the U.S. is in charge of Venezuela. Global leaders today convening an emergency meeting at the UN. CNN's Evan Perez and Laura Coates are joining us now from live outside the court where Maduro was arraigned a short time ago. Laura, we're also just getting some of those first sketches in from court. Walk us through what happened earlier today.
It was an outstanding and shocking moment in American history to watch the self-proclaimed president of Venezuela and his first lady in a Manhattan courtroom after years of awaiting arraignment in this federal case. It includes 4 charges for Maduro and, of course, 3 for his wife. He stood steadfast. He was confident. He was very stoic. He had some difficulties getting up and down out of his chair, bracing himself on either arm of his chair. If you remember that so-called perp walk from the helipad, he seemed to have some problem with his left leg, and that appeared to be continuing to bother him as he tried to sit and stand repeatedly. His wife, far less confident, far more demure, much more soft-spoken, both proclaiming their innocence. She had visible injuries on her face that her lawyers addressed, including on her temple. There were bandages, and on her forehead as well. They alluded to severely bruised ribs as well. He said he was innocent, began to talk immediately and describe that he had been captured and taken, abducted, and was a prisoner of war. He had one request, that was for the consulate, and also to have the notes. There were copious notes that he was taking to be with him and also respected, but they did not ask for bail at this time.
And Evan, what's next for Maduro and his wife?
Well, the next time that we're going to see them in federal court is not till March. And so until between now and then, there's a lot of legal work, the beginning of the legal work that you started seeing today. Barry Pollack, who is a well-known attorney in Washington, who is representing Maduro. We expect that, well, one of the things he mentioned was that he is going to be making that bail request. Of course, that did not happen today. But obviously, one of the first places that I think the legal team is going to go is the detention. We know that, as we've discussed before, they are being held at this very grim place, which is the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, New York. It's a place where there's catalogs of some of the inhumane conditions. These are the words of federal judges who have discussed this about some of the defendants that are being held there. There is a problem there with medical care that the Justice Department itself has documented. That is going to be an issue because one of the things that Celia Flores, his attorney, today mentioned was that she has some injuries. I don't know if those injuries were sustained during the raid that plucked them from Caracas and brought them here. Again, those are things that are going to be laid out. One of the things we heard, Laura, today from the lawyers was the complexity of some of the issues in this case. Obviously, the indictment is a pretty straightforward indictment. It talks about narco-terrorism and cocaine importation charges, but the more complex part of this is the fact that he believes and he says that he's still the leader of Venezuela. Under international law, he believes that this was an illegal abduction that happened today. So that is what is going to play out in court beginning in the next few months.
And can I just tell you guys, to set the scene for you, around us all day there have been protests right off camera where there were people who were debating the legality of having removed him from Venezuela, others who were talking about free Maduro, others who were talking about no blood for oil. There is a variety of opinions. But inside that courtroom, one of our news associates witnessed a protester at the very end, as they were being escorted out, stand up and confront Maduro and essentially tell him, you will pay for what you have done. Maduro responding to this person, pointing his finger up towards the sky, telling him he is a man of God and remains the president of the Republic of Venezuela.
A really stunning moment inside that courtroom. Laura Coates, Evan Perez, thank you both so much. Joining us now to discuss further is CNN legal analyst and national security analyst Carrie Cordero. Carrie, thank you so much for joining us as always. You posted your thoughts on Substack about this case and particularly the more broad legal risk that the U.S. faces with some of its moves in Venezuela. What do you see as those risks?
Well, so I think it's important to separate the criminal case against the Maduros and their co-conspirators from the broader geopolitical issues that are at play that were described, covered in the UN discussions today, and the questions that U.S. policymakers and the public has about a potential long-term engagement in Venezuela, whether that's military or political or and so forth. And so I think there are a number of risks with that broader engagement that the president has launched in this particular case. So on one hand, with respect to the legal risks, the fact that the U.S. government took this action could potentially signal to other autocrats, dictators throughout the world, that they too can just unilaterally go in and remove a head of state. And so it's important, as the United States continues this effort, to distinguish between the criminal case that they've brought against the Maduros. The United States will obviously continue its arguments that it has executed a law enforcement activity, not just a military operation, when it arrested and captured the Maduros, and separate that from potential military engagement or what the president described in his press conference over the week, that the United States was going to run the country. Right. And I think that's diplomatically where there is potential risk that if the United States is interpreted as simply stepping on the sovereignty of another country, that will have consequences globally.
How does this case stack up with the comparison to Manuel Noriega in Panama, another leader that the United States ousted and then that was convicted in U.S. court?
Yeah, I think the Noriega case is really the closest example that we can look to in modern American history for a sitting de facto government head of state that is removed from their position to then face criminal charges in the United States for drug trafficking. It was a different operation that took place. That was an actual military invasion that the United States engaged in versus this very discreet arrest and capture operation that the United States conducted over the weekend against the Maduros. So there is that difference, but it is someone who was purporting to be the head of state and in both circumstances, and then was brought to the United States to face justice under an indictment. The similarity is that they are being prosecuted, one was, and then these are being prosecuted for drug trafficking and related crimes. In the example of Noriega, he actually took the case all the way to trial. And so there was a several weeks long trial, and he was convicted and was sentenced to U.S. prison. Then he was extradited many years later to France and ended up back in Panama, where he died. But there is a track record. These aren't obviously frequent cases, but there is at least that historical example.
The judge obviously has to weigh the argument that Maduro already made in court, that he is the legitimate president of Venezuela, and therefore, you would imagine his lawyers will argue he should receive some form of diplomatic immunity. The U.S. has basically argued that he fraudulently kept power during the last election in July of 2024, when, globally it's pretty much agreed upon that the opposition won that election. How do you see the judge weighing those arguments?
Well, I think that's the question I have for the process of this criminal case is, will the judge allow the defense attorneys to litigate out that issue, which is really going to be an issue of law, whether or not the sovereignty applies to him and whether or not he can be excused from the case altogether. Or whether that proceeds on a separate track and the case goes forward as a matter of proving the actual facts that are alleged in the indictment. And we'll have to wait to see how the judge handles those issues.
There's also the question of whether this engagement with Venezuela is a war in itself, because Maduro has said that he's a prisoner of war. He made the argument. It's unclear exactly how his defense attorneys might pursue that, but there is an argument to be made that the United States, in its own rationalizing the attacks on these drug boats, they're saying that they're at war with Venezuela. Do they now have to contradict them?